Hello, welcome back to another very exciting history video. Very exciting history. Today we're going to be starting our topic, our unit, of the causes and effects of 20th century wars. So today specifically we're going to be talking about the Algerian War, but over the course of the next little while, I'm going to be going over several 20th century wars and talking about their impacts. And the goal is that you do not necessarily need to know for paper 2, because this is what the exam will use these for, is paper 2. You don't necessarily need to know these exact wars. You just need to know a series of wars from the 20th century, and you need to be able to draw connections between them. You need to be able to find differences between them. You might be asked something like, how did technology impact 3 wars in the 20th century? And you need to be able to talk about technology in 3 wars from the 20th century. Okay? So without further ado, we're just going to jump right into it. So the Algerian War. We are mainly talking about post-World War II time frame. Generally, the information ranges from 1945 to 1962. We'll be going through a lot of the events of the war, but it's important to keep in mind you don't necessarily need to know these events. You just need to be able to draw connections based on these events. Okay? So I hopefully will have some nice fancy editing. You'll be able to see a timeline. Can you see it? I don't know, I haven't put it in yet. If I don't do that, that was awkward. So one of the main things that is in the Algerian War that we are going to be talking about, by the way, I'm reading off of notes, is guerrilla warfare, or guerrilla war. It was a guerrilla war. And I don't mean guerrilla as in the animal, I mean guerrilla warfare as in, we've all heard of guerrilla warfare, but do you know what it means? So guerrilla warfare is going to involve irregular forces involved in an ongoing struggle with an established army. So there are 2 sides. In this war, it's going to be the FLN, which is the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN. We're going to be calling it the FLN because I don't speak French. The FLN against the French. The French was a very established army. They had their life together, but the FLN was not. They were a ragtag team of whoever was fighting, poking the French until they won. Okay? Which, by the way, they did win. Algeria is its own place. They got independence. That's the outcome of the war. It's not a spoiler alert because it's history. Okay. So the French, like I said, is an established army. The FLN is going to be a non-established army, and that's the FLN is fighting on behalf of Algeria. And for guerrilla warfare, your tactical strategy and political goals are very closely related. So the groups that were doing the guerrilla warfare were very, very closely tied to the groups who were going to be making these political decisions, okay? Okay, so when I say irregular, and we talk about it being irregular forces, they're not official, they are not full-time, they are not professional, they are sometimes not even trained. So these are just your friend Joe, he's gonna go kill somebody, and that's guerrilla warfare. It's chaotic. It's usually hit and run attacks. So I talked earlier about just poking the French until they won, and that's basically what you did. You went and pestered the army and hurt them until it broke morale or they ran out of supplies and you won the war. That was guerrilla warfare. That's what they did to win the Algeria War, and it worked. It worked. So many 20th century wars for independence used guerrilla warfare because I believe we'll talk about it in the future, but Mao's People's Army that got their independence, they used guerrilla warfare and it worked really well. And so everybody said, I like that. Let's do that too. And they did, and it worked. Keep in mind, it doesn't always work, but that is one connection you can draw. Several of the wars that we're going to be talking about are going to use guerrilla warfare, and it's going to be effective. At the time, they didn't really have many ways to combat guerrilla warfare, so it was one of the best ways they could win. So the other thing that is different or unusual about guerrilla warfare is that I mentioned, like, it could just be your friend Joe over there who's going and killing somebody. They were identical to the general population. So it could be your friend Joe, and he wouldn't even put on a military uniform before he went and hurt somebody. We often talk about the red coats because they wore red coats. We think of military uniforms. They didn't have that. They didn't use that. The tactic was to look like general population to cause psychological strain on the army. If you are continually getting poked by someone who looks like a civilian, you are going to be wary of every civilian you see. And that was part of the goal of guerrilla warfare. And again, it worked. So it's not really constrained by law. They just kind of take and modify weapons to use. They get their food supplies from the general population. It was made common by the success of the Mao's People Army in China, which again we talked about. In Mao's People's Army in China were the original people who did it, and everybody said, oh wow, that worked good. All right, so let's move into the causes of the Algerian War. So there are going to be two types of causes that I'll be talking about, probably with every single one of these kind of 20th century wars. And it's going to be long-term causes and short-term causes. We'll start with the long-term because that makes sense. So this isn't really necessarily specified the years all the time, but just assume that it was a good portion of time before the actual situation started to occur, okay? So in this case, we do actually have a time frame for the first point, which is the 1830s to 1840s. And that is when Algeria was colonized by the French. They had cheap land and there were jobs available, and the French said, I like that. And they took it, as the French do. So the Europeans wanted to assimilate Algeria administratively and culturally. So they wanted to, and this is again going to be something that comes up in many of these wars for independence in the 20th century. The European country that was colonizing wanted to assimilate the culture to become exactly like them. For the French, they wanted to just take over. They loved it. Initially, Algeria resisted a bit, and so there were already tensions in the beginning. Of course, nobody wants to be colonized, but Algeria really didn't want to be colonized. They were already using a few of these guerrilla warfare tactics to try and fight back, and though it wasn't necessarily working very well, they were trying. The other thing to keep in mind is when, this is a very common thing, I don't think it's mentioned in a lot of these 20th century wars, but it is very common. If someone of usually European descent, takes over someone who is not from Europe, they're going to bring what, children? Disease, suffering. There was a lot of disease and a lot of people died. This caused the native population to decline very heavily and very steeply by the 1870s. This is like 30 to 40 years after they were colonized, that the general population is still dipping. And this resulted in a lot of economic issues, and the Muslims that lived in Algeria initially were very discontent because they were becoming illiterate in Arabic. They were unemployed. 90% of the wealth in the country was focused in only 10% of the population. So when that happens, we have like a hierarchy where most of the people in the country are very, very poor and very few are very, very rich. We think of this now in America, but by then it was even worse because, again, there was such heavy unemployment. It was almost impossible to get a job if you were a native. There was illiteracy in Arabic, which made it very difficult to get a job. And so there was a very high Muslim birth rate, which again happens when we don't have education. It was just not a good situation. So the Pied Noirs, which basically means Blackfoots, I believe, are going to be the French settlers and their descendants who are living in Algeria. So if you came from France and you lived in Algeria, you and your children would be called Pied Noirs. There was essentially just political chaos. It was just crazy. dependence on Marshall aid, which we will talk about when we talk about the Cold War, but essentially that was aid provided by the United States, in turn asking for these countries to basically pass political reform so that they'd remain not communist, because America was very concerned with communism at the time. But they depended very heavily on the money from the Marshall Plan, which we'll talk about later. Marshall aid. They had very high inflation. They had strikes and decreasing exports and slow growth, and it was just not good economically. So this is a point that you might want to bring up. There was heavy dependence on the Marshall aid, the Marshall Plan, and this caused economic issues, especially because there was a poor distribution of the wealth in the country. So then we talk about the political profits from Algeria to the French. And that was why the French wanted to keep Algeria on. And this is, I'm going to keep saying this, common with the 20th century wars, where a European country will look at another country and say, well, you make us a lot of money, and so we don't really care if you're happy. And that's terrible. So let's move on to the short-term causes of the Algerian War. I should start going through this a little faster. Short-term causes, end of World War II. Again, this has an impact on the Cold War that was happening, which therefore impacts the Marshall Plan. And this has an impact on, at the time, a lot of European colonies were saying, hey, we don't want to be colonized anymore. The end of World War II just caused a lot of unrest, and that was a big point that the Algerians had on their side for wanting to start the war when they did. They wanted equality and autonomy, as many people do, as you probably should. There was reverence. They wanted reverence, and they wanted traditional Islam and left-wing agenda. Complete independence became the goal for the revolution, because at this point they had decided that they needed to become independent, but that was going to be their main goal, was traditional Islam, left-wing agenda, and independence. The FLN encompassed these goals. So Ben Bella was the person who was the head or in charge of the FLN, which again was that like Algerian side on the war. They encompassed these goals, and they decided when it was going to be the right time to start the war. They were the ones who started the war, was the FLN. The other thing that made the FLN kind of realize this was the right time was that the French started considering Algeria an integral part of Metro France. So what's important about this is remembering that Algeria doesn't want to be a part of France, right? So then let's talk about our combatants. And what I mean by combatants is, now that we moved on from the causes, let's just talk about who the people were that were fighting, who the sides were, and how they were fighting. So we've already talked a little bit about the FLN. We know that they were the ones doing the guerrilla warfare. The ALN was their army. So many countries have a different name for their army because they're extra. And the ALN was the army of the FLN. I might at times use those interchangeably. You'll feel the gist. You'll get it. Their plan was to divide the country into 6 zones, making a commander for each one, and their jobs were military recruitment, political indoctrination, taxation, assassination, intimidation. Lots of jobs. They were doing lots of things. But their plan to break up Algeria into smaller parts was a good plan, because then it meant that not everything fell on one person's shoulders, and there was more division, basically, to keep the country separate, even though they were fighting together. It made it harder for the French to take over, essentially, take back over. Central command was started in Tunisia. We're going to call it Tunisia. That is definitely not how you say it. Tunisia and Morocco. Those are going to come back up again. That's basically where the FLN headquarters were. And while I understand they aren't in Algeria, that was the point. They didn't want to bring the war. They knew the French would not want to bring the war into another country. And so by going over there And setting up their headquarters there, they kind of prevented that from happening. They prevented themselves from being taken over from the inside out. Okay? So the troops stayed with them to go into Algeria when needed. So basically, they just brought their whole headquarters over there where they knew they'd be safer. They used stolen hunting rifles. They used post-1956 World War II era arms and machine guns. So it was a lot of like not very up-to-date machinery. Mass transport was very rare. It was very haphazard. Their main supporter was Egypt. And again, they're using guerrilla warfare. The French started with 72,000 soldiers and upped their game to 400,000 during the conflict. They got pretty serious. However, because of the way the FLN had set up their defense of Algeria, the French had a hard time maintaining an army in Algeria. So because of the guerrilla warfare and the psychological issues that came along with it, the French had a very hard time keeping an army there. It was a very low morale group. They had pretty much just gotten out of World War II, more or less. And so everybody was kind of like, we just did this big war. They were all kind of untrained. This was a big thing in this war, is not many of the soldiers had a lot of formal training. They were not very excited. But despite that, despite not being a very into it group, they were equipped and they were very modern, which is always going to be a plus to have the most modern technology. And one example of this is the helicopter, which made transport very easy and accessible, and mass transport was possible. There were their main like shtick was to use sector forces to restrict FLN movement, because when you have guerrilla warfare, their job is going to be to dart all over the place and basically just to be chaos. And so the French wanted to restrict their movement and therefore restrict their abilities to remain in contact and to remain logical. That was their main idea. They wanted to go on a lot of search and destroy missions as well. So now we're going to move on to talking about different events as a part of the war. So we're going to start out in 1955. I know I said that the topics of the war started in, I believe, 1945, but that's not where we're starting our story, friends. We're going to start our story in 1955. November 1st, 1954, a bombing by FLN targets police stations, army posts, and government buildings. So basically the FLN started this war by bombing, and guess what? Nobody cared. It didn't trigger any level of an uprising. The French were like, okay, dude. It was kind of sad because the FLN had been planning this. They really thought it was the right time to start this war, and it didn't work. They continued trying minor bombings, and France really did ignore this for a little while. They had military in Algeria, and basically what happened is they held an assassination campaign because they were like, okay, guys, enough is enough, die. And so they held an assassination campaign for FLN leaders, and this caused guerrilla attacks. This is the beginning of that guerrilla warfare, really starting back up after the beginning when we had talked about like when they had just been colonized. So the FLN started terrorizing Pieds Noirs, which again are the French in Algeria and their descendants in Algeria. They really started terrorizing them. They attacked a city, killing like 123 people on both sides combined. And they were all civilians. So really going at it with like, we don't care who you are. If you are French, you should suffer, basically. That brings this idea of collective responsibility. So the best way to think of collective responsibility is when we'd be in elementary school and one kid would do something wrong and the teacher would say, okay, well, if nobody's gonna fess up, I guess it's everybody's fault. And so it's everybody's fault and nobody gets recess, even though only one kid did something. The same idea applies here. It's holding all members of a single population accountable for the actions of just a few. So this is what the FLN was doing to the French, because a few of them were making the world a dangerous, not good place. They decided to hold all of the French, including the Pieds Noirs, accountable. So then the Pieds Noirs started holding terror campaigns, resulting in more Algerians joining the FLN. So when Algerians really started to see like, hey, okay, these French guys here, they're pretty mean. They said, okay, then we can start joining the FLN too and attacking with them. This brings us to 1956. This is when the French efforts really started to intensify. So before, the French were kind of taking a back seat. They were like, let's wait this out. They'll get bored. And they didn't get bored. And so then the French started moving those who were suspected of supporting the FLN away. They started implementing like really limited economic reforms to calm down the citizens. So they were like, you can have 2 more cents than you used to. Here, happy? And the citizens said, okay. They were really not doing a lot, but they were pretending they were doing a lot. They were also using their helicopters to root out, like, find out where the FLN fighters were, because they did kind of travel in small little packs, right? And they were trying to find them. This reduced the impact of the guerrilla use of infrastructure. So infrastructure is going to kind of encompass any level of like buildings or like anything built into the city or country is going to be considered, in my mind, the infrastructure. So because the French had eyes due to their helicopters, the FLN was not able to use that infrastructure as effectively as they would have liked. They needed supplies. It really, at this point already, started to become a battle to outlast the other. And this is going to be something that is pretty common in this war and probably some of the others, is that the two sides are really just trying to stick it out and see who can stick it out further. And that's something we can see in the Ukraine-Russia war today, is we're just waiting to see who sticks it out the longest. So, the Battle of Algiers, I can't pronounce any of this. This is when the FLN moved the war to the city, though. They moved the war to the city, they started terror attacks, they hoped to gain attention and support, and that's not what happened. It just became harder for them to hide because of the cities. There were many fighters in the cities, and they had a lot of fighters captured because there were so many of them and nowhere to hide. They had a lot of people captured and information was pulled out through torture. And this kind of was a turning point, even though it might not seem it, in favor of the FLN. When the French population saw that the French government was using torture to get information out of the FLN fighters, they really started to dislike the war. This is, in my mind, very important to understanding the war and why it went the way it did, because it was so deeply low morale. And not just in the way that it was the army that was low morale, it was also the citizens who were like, you're really using torture. Like, it was just not a good situation for the French to be fighting, but they held on because Algeria makes them a lot of money, and the money makes the world go round. So then we move on to Morris Line and the Battle of the Frontiers. Battle of the Frontiers is kind of a big deal. So in these, France had granted Tunisia and Morocco their independence. Yay! And so the Maurice Line was a fortified barrier between Algeria and Tunisia, and it helped to keep the FLN fighters in Tunisia. So the French knew that these FLN fighters were in Tunisia, but they couldn't attack them, so instead they had this Maurice Line where they built a really fortified barrier to try and keep them there. The thought being, because all of their fighters were in Tunisia, if they couldn't make their way over to Algeria, then they couldn't fight. Despite this, though, the FLN had no trouble continuing their attacks over top of this line. French begin to question whether Algeria is really worth all this effort. Like, this is a lot, yo. This is a lot, and they don't know that they're necessarily getting the same return as they're putting in. Again, everybody's kind of like not into it in France. Nobody's into it, as you should not be. war is bad. So the ALN or the FLN increases their efforts trying to bring weapons over that line because, again, they don't really have very many weapons or very many good weapons. And France started the Battle of the Frontiers, which was a battle that the ALN was losing. Then, France goes under a change, and now there's a new constitution called the French Fifth Republic, and there was a political stability, and there was a president, and things changed, and then we had the Chalet Plan. The Chalet Plan brought a new military strategy to France. So France just went from the Fourth French Republic to the French Fifth Republic. And now everything is different except some things are different. And one of those things is this new military strategy where France is working with the Urban Renewal Project. They are concentrating troops in the north and moving to the west because that was how Algeria was weaker. So they were really trying to hone in on those weak spots. They were kicking up their naval patrols, which was something, again, that the FLN was weak with because they were using guerrilla tactics. This was actually pretty successful. The ALN was shrinking pretty steadily. They had finally kind of found their groove, but this is when the terror attacks and the week of barricades begins. Despite their weakened state at this time, the FLN continues terror attacks, and they even increase them, and they started to impact this new figure of political stability, this president, de Gaulle. And de Gaulle put the issue up to a referendum, which, if we don't know what a referendum is, it's when people vote and say, do we really care? And the answer was no. They did not really care. But the Pieds Noirs did, because they were the French living in Algeria. And they actually put up some barricades, and they were like, no, we definitely care. And then they took them down again, because apparently they did not really care. Chaos. I'm telling you, chaos. I actually really like this war because just nothing happens. And at this point, de Gaulle says, yeah, who cares anymore? And recognizes the freedom and the independence of Algeria. So a quote that can be taken from this war that is kind of impactful and I really liked is that, quote, a regular army loses if it does not win. A guerrilla army wins if it does not lose. So this is really kind of hones in on what makes guerrilla warfare so strong, is that they don't necessarily have to win. They just have to be the last man standing. And this is more true than for other wars because guerrilla warfare is so sporadic and is really meant to chip away at the other side. So then let's briefly talk about the effects of the war. Obviously, Algeria has gotten its freedom, gotten its independence, baby. It won. Algeria won. The underdog won. The casualties was counting the casualties was especially difficult because for guerrilla warfare, again, the fighters appear to be very similar to the general population. It makes it very difficult to count who's dead. It was brutal and costly. There was an estimated 500,000 to 1 million people who died from this war. There was the Evian Accords, which basically was a ceasefire, ensuring the safety of all French citizens and giving the Algerian their independence. The only other sticking point of this war is that the unhappy Pieds Noirs continued attacks on both countries for some time. No, they were just kind of caught in the middle of the whole thing because they're half here and half there, and they were just not happy with either side, and they really wouldn't have been happy with either side unless everything stayed the same, so they were just kind of caught in the middle. But now we have learned about the Algerian War. So what can you do now that you have this information? Well, the biggest thing would be to go and find some Algerian specific questions based on paper 2. because this is the content, again, you will be using for paper 2. Study this video, come up with your own flashcards, really hone in on the information. It's important to know the information because on the IB history exam, there are no multiple choice questions. It is all essay style questions. Yay. So you need to know this information or be able to at least reference it in your mind. Something that's important to keep in mind is that the topics that I went down, so the events of the war, so like we talked about the Battle of Algiers, the Battle of the Frontiers, the Shalal Plan, all of these are going to be in order. And so while I didn't necessarily tell you the specific year for each, one of the nice things about IB history is that you don't need to memorize dates. You just need to memorize the order of things. So if you know the Battle of the Frontiers came after the Battle of the Algiers, or that you know that the Maurice Line caused the Battle of the Frontiers, then you can say, shortly after putting up the Maurice Line, the Battle of the Frontiers occurred. And that's going to gain you your point for knowing the order of history. That's going to gain you your point for knowing the dates. That's really exciting. So find a timeline. Can you fill it in? Can you fill in all the years? Can you fill in all the information? Can you write a little blurb about each thing that happened? Try and keep up with the content and try and use this content to write one of those essay questions. This is going to be easier once you know more of the wars. So I will have more videos coming out based on more of the wars, but it's very exciting that you've learned your first one. Now learn it well, okay? This is going to be one of the easier ones. It's pretty short, it's pretty simple, and it has a lot of the components that you can use to compare and contrast to the other 20th century wars. This is a great war to learn. I hope you learned something today. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments or DM me or text me, and yay.